Good day to you all. How is everyone? You haven't seen my face in a long time, so I thought I'd give you the opportunity. No, I do think in a online class, it is important sometimes to make this a bit more human than it otherwise can appear, so that you know there actually is another human being at the other end of all your emails and assignments, etc., etc. Also, at this point in the semester, people are panicking, understandably, and especially about what you see in front of you on the screen, the essay, the dreaded essay assignment. So here, I'm here to give you some assistance. I've come to the rescue, the cavalry, to the rescue, to give you instructions and some guidance. Now, admittedly, some of this comes from the instructions that are written already in the syllabus, but with my gloss on top of it and worded a slightly different way on the PowerPoint, it should be of usefulness and some help. This is also going to be, if it isn't already posted, on Canvas under Files, Essay, Instructions as well. I mean, just the small little PowerPoint part of it here. So you can listen to this, go back to this and pause it if you want, or just go back and look at the instructions on in Files if you need to. So this is an argumentative essay, first and foremost. There are many different types of essay styles. Argumentative is one you learn in, I think, English 1C. If you haven't done one because you haven't been in English 1C yet, well, you're going to learn early here. So I don't expect you to be perfect on it, but you should listen to the instructions as much as possible. So this is much like the standard 5-paragraph essay that many of you learn either earlier in college or sometimes even before that in grade school, high school, etc. So it's an argumentative essay fits well with a 5-paragraph essay or vice versa, though it doesn't have to be exactly 5. I'm just saying the logical structure of it is more or less the same. It needs to start with an introduction, and the introductory paragraph should really include 3 things, as we'll see. Context, thesis, essay map. So a few sentences putting the question into a larger framework, and then kind of narrowing it down from there. We'll come back to that. Your answer to the question, your position on the question, your conclusion. Those are all the same thing, by the way. In an essay like this, the conclusion comes at the beginning, or more correct to say that it comes at the very end of the first paragraph. So more or less the beginning of the essay. So you're not keeping it in suspense like some sort of spy novel or murder mystery or something until the last page. You're telling me what the answer is up front, and then going back and spinning the meat of the essay, convincing the reader that yours is the correct or the best answer to the question. And then the third part of the introduction is your dreaded essay map. 3 arguments that you'll make in support of your thesis. 1, 2, 3. And again, those can be divided up into 3 separate paragraphs. Argument 1, 2, 3. Or you could do a couple paragraphs for each argument. For argument number 1, you could do 2 paragraphs. Argument number 2, 1 paragraph. Doesn't matter as long as it makes sense the way you've organized it. Each supporting argument needs to include evidence, from our textbook, events from our book. You can use outside sources, though it's not necessary, as well. Statistics, quotes from the text, and any other sources you use. That's a must, really. You need to use at least a few pithy, they don't have to be long quotes, kind of sprinkled throughout the essay in support of your thesis or position. Then a conclusion right after all that kind of just summarizes what your position was, make it very clear, though hold on to that because that's somewhat optional. A conclusion is not that important here. I'm going to suggest in a few minutes something that you might do instead of that. What the bleep is an essay map? Who wrote that? I'm glad you asked, though. I really am, because I might have forgotten that this very loud slide was here. But what is an essay map? I didn't make up the phrase, by the way. A lot of English textbooks on argumentative and other types of essays use the phrase essay map. Not everyone does, but it's pretty common. In fact, what you see in front of you here, the middle part of this slide, I stole from the internet. Shame on me. Again, in this case, your essay map is 3 different and discrete arguments that all do the same thing, exact same thing. Support your thesis position. Discrete means entirely separate. You need to try to stay away from logical overlap and sort of one argument bleeding into the other. That's something you'll have to try to get a feel for on your own. It can be one of the most challenging aspects to this type of essay, so keep that in mind. You want to keep each argument logically distinct. What they have in common is that they all support your thesis. They all say, whatever I claimed was the right answer or best answer, argument number 1 supports it. Argument number 2, using different evidence, those different evidence, it comes to the same thing. In argument number 3, guess what? Different type of evidence there, but it also leads back to the same conclusion. Boom, 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 and you've supported your thesis. Of course, this is an example only. The one you see here comes from an English classroom like that. If you read that, it's obviously not a history essay, but the logic is the same, so use it as you see fit, or not. A sample thesis statement from an actual history question and from a history class. I know this for a fact because I used this exact question. I wrote this question. Not that it's anything brand new. This question is asked all the time in one way or another, and I ask it quite succinctly in my 17B or 311 class, depending on which college you are. By the way, I'm doing this generically. I'm not going to do a separate video here for every single class. So, and all of my classes, not all of them, there are a number of different types of argumentative essays that are being assigned. So you have to kind of just apply this as much as possible to your class and the type that you're doing. I'm doing 3 different argumentative essay assignments. So they're all argumentative, but there's some differences. So if something doesn't seem to apply to you, that's why it probably doesn't. Those of you that are taking a class where the 1920s in the United States is relevant, can't answer this question because the essay that you're doing doesn't have this question. But it is one that I use. I think I used it even last semester in some of my classes. So simply put, I ask, was the 1920s truly a decade of prosperity in good times, or was it something less than that? And the opening paragraph, guess what? Back to our 3 different elements, right? Context, thesis, essay map. So I've got context, and I say here in parentheses in all 3 cases, don't write context, don't write thesis, don't write essay map. I'm putting those there as labels for you to understand how these pieces fit together, but you don't need to write those. The reason that that's on there, though it might seem obvious, I have students that if I don't say that, will actually write context, thesis, essay map, and it loses the flow of an essay. This isn't an essay I'm writing for you. This is instructions as to how to write an essay, which is different. So, but the parts that are in quotes are actually essay. In fact, this is an essay from, I think it was last semester, from one of my students that I sort of just grabbed somewhat arbitrarily. I made sure it was a pretty decent essay, if not better. So the student said in answer to the above question, in American popular culture, the movies and television and everyday life, the decade of the 1920s is often presented and apparently thought of as a glamorous and fun-filled time period where everyone appears to be successful. I actually like the way they put that. Images of flappers, jazz music, speakeasies, Babe Ruth, and other things fill our heads, making the decade like, I think they meant look like, or maybe I left that out, one long celebration or party. I like the way the whole thing is put. I would change a couple things around if I was writing it, but it still makes the point, I think, in a pretty good way. It's clear. Then the thesis would come just immediately after this. You wouldn't. It's still the same paragraph, just period after party, and the next word in quotations. However, would be next, and now you're launching into your thesis. However, when examined carefully, the evidence suggests that though there certainly remains some truth to the above image, in reality, for many Americans, the 1920s was a difficult battle against unseemly forces in the society and remained far from an era of prosperity and good times. There it is, very clear. The question asks, was it an era of prosperity and good times? Just straightforwardly, no, it wasn't. I mean, there's a little bit of hedging in there, which is totally fine, right? Some truth to the above image, but overall, society, for many Americans, not an era of prosperity and good times. So it's not totally one-sided, doesn't have to be, but it does make a clear answer, a clear position has been taken. You're taking a stand. This student is taking a stand right here. The essay map, then, which follows in the next sentence, it could even be done in the same sentence, depending on how you word it. But if we peel surface appearances away and look closely at the dominant political, economic, as well as cultural dynamics of the decade, we can see this quite clearly. And so here, now the essay map is actually even simpler than it looks, and it's one sentence anyway, but it's basically telling me, it's giving me a sneak preview of what's to follow, which is what I want here. I know already what their answer to the question is going to be, and now they're mapping it out, essay map. They're telling me that this essay is going to be divided into 3 arguments. First, one about the political situation in the 1920s, which now I've already been promised here. It's kind of like you're making a promise to me, the sneak preview, what's going to follow. You have to now deliver. So they're saying, okay, that if we look at politics, the political situation in the 1920s, it's going to show that this was far from an era of prosperity. And then the second argument, if we look at economics, the economy in the 1920s, that's apparently going to also show us that the 20s was not primarily about prosperity and good times, remained far from that. And third, in the third argument, cultural dynamics are also something about American culture in the 20s is going to also show that most Americans were far from prosperity and good times. So the map is simple, 3 parts, 3 arguments: political, economic, cultural. And note, these are all separate spheres of American life and society. So the political sphere, and then and whatever's happening in politics. I forget how what this essay focused on, but the argument is going to marshal evidence and quotes, statistics from the text that shows that makes the case that politics indicates an era that was far from prosperity and good times. And then the economy, a different sphere of American life, and yet it's going to lead back, if all goes well, to the same conclusion: not an era of prosperity and good times primarily. And third, the argument about American culture will lead to the same conclusion. Think of yourself as a prosecuting attorney. If what I just said in the previous slides doesn't make sense to you, then think of it this way. This is just a useful tool. You don't have to. If you already understand it, you can just turn this off and go away, and I'll shut up. I mean, I'll keep talking, but I might as well have shut up because you turned the computer off, or just hit exit. So a prosecuting attorney really is making this kind of an argument. In a sense, he's doing a verbal version of an argumentative essay. That's true. So let's say you're the assistant district attorney for Sacramento County, and you're trying a murder case to make it ultra dramatic. And so the thesis question that, like, the community's asking you is the defendant guilty? And your answer to that question, right, is your thesis statement. And of course, as the DA, you have no choice but to argue this. So it's not a perfect example. It's not perfect, but you get it. The defendant is guilty, is your position. Now, the defense is going to argue the other side, of course, and so they have no choice but to argue, no, the defendant is not guilty. So they would have the opposite thesis, of course. And in your essay map, you're going to lay out different types of evidence. Again, discrete, distinct types of evidence, but they're all going to lead back to the same thing. At least that's what you'd be arguing if you were that district attorney. So let's say on the opening day of the trial, you're making opening arguments, and there's going to be 3 following days of the trial. So day 1 is just opening arguments, and you're telling the jury, tomorrow we're going to come back and we're going to look at the evidence from the crime scene, and after tomorrow, you're going to be convinced that from the crime scene, there's really no other conclusion than defendant is guilty. And then we're going to come back the following day, and we're going to look just at the evidence about the murder weapon, other things found in the defendant's home, which wasn't the murder scene, so separate category of evidence. And yet, at the end of that day, you're going to be even further convinced that there's no other conclusion than defendant guilty. And the last day of the trial, we're going to look at the defendant's motive. He had a life insurance policy, or she did. I shouldn't assume it was a man. It usually is. But life insurance policy in event of spouse's death. Suspicious motive. And so by the end of that day, you're going to be convinced from just that evidence alone, plus the evidence presented the following, the previous days, in 3 separate categories now, that it all leads back in law and scholarship, they sometimes call science, they sometimes call convergence of evidence. All the different strands of evidence converge back on the same point, and that is defendant guilty. If it's the 1920s, they all go back to 1920s, not primarily a period of good times and prosperity. Not a decade of prosperity primarily. So all 3 arguments, separate types or pieces of evidence, yet they all come to the same conclusion: defendant guilty. Some further tips for a successful essay, and you be wary of the term tips here. I should have said this more emphatically. These are really more than tips. I mean, they'll help you write a good essay, but you really need to do most of these things, except for the last one, which I'm kind of leaving optional. I'll just read this and then comment. Avoid at all costs providing a narrative rehashing of historical events. There is such a thing as a narrative essay or a descriptive essay, but that's not what we are doing here. So stay away from telling me a story. This happened, then this, blah, 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 blah. That's not what we're doing. It's quite tempting to do that in a history class, okay, they asked me a question on ancient Rome. Okay, I'm just going to start giving them some facts about ancient Rome in order when they happened. Okay, but that's not answering a specific argumentative question. It's not. You're not taking a position. You can mesh those together, but you're not going to do that here. That's not what we're doing. So you're on the wrong track if you're just piling up facts and events one after the other. You only need, in fact, enough facts in your essay to support your thesis and position. In fact, that should be a test. Any event you tell me about in, I don't know, 1, 3, however many sentences it takes, and if you ask yourself, and you should, how does this help me to support my position, my thesis? How does this fit my argument? If it doesn't, guess what? It's irrelevant, and it will be useless to you because it'll be just like filling up space with maybe just letters that were just gibberish. It might as well be, because it has no point being there. So you only need to marshal, and only should marshal, enough facts and reference to events, explanation of events, as help you to support your argument, to support your thesis. You must provide evidence in the form of quotes. Again, there needs to be at least a few, if not more, quotes sprinkled around here and there. Not a lot, because it's a short essay. You don't want it to be mostly quotes, so keep it limited, but have it somewhat balanced. So you need to make reference to events, as needed, as I said above, statistics from the textbook, etc. So quotes, events, facts, statistics, marshaled on behalf of your argument and thesis. Also, make sure you take a clear position when you lay out your thesis statement at the very beginning. I have students a lot that it seems to them like they're taking a stand, taking a position, drawing a conclusion, but they're not. So you must have a position, meaning your conclusion about the question being asked. The position can be nuanced and balanced, can be somewhat wishy-washy. Well, it's a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but it still needs to be clear. It can be one-sided too. So you go, no, the 20s was, you're damn right, it was a decade of prosperity and good times. All right? It can be that emphatic, but you need to then make that very clear and then back it up. This sounds obvious, but I have a lot of students that, as I said, appear to believe that they've already laid out a position and they haven't, and so they never do. So sometimes those students will say something like, write something like, well, the 1920s is a decade that historians still argue over and debate. Some think it was an era of good times and prosperity. Others believe that that's very overrated, and in fact think that the era was much more one of struggle and poverty and crime and problems than it was prosperity. And in the following paragraphs, we're going to look at sort of both sides of that. That's not a position taken. That's saying there is this position, and some historians believe that, and there's this other position, some believe that, and we're going to examine those, which might be a useful thing to do, an interesting thing to do, and would fit some essay formats, but it doesn't fit this essay format, because an argumentative essay, by definition, requires you to take a clear position. All right? So, also, another way to, if this isn't, some of this is overkill if you already understand it, so you can turn this off again accordingly. Think of the thesis/essay map as a sneak preview, I think I said this already too, of what is to be said in the following paragraphs. And then make sure what follows sticks exactly to that. You're making me a promise in this sneak preview. Here's what I promise you, Prof, in the paragraphs to follow. One of the reasons that this is important is because you don't want the reader, in this case me, having to thumb backwards and forwards in the essay to figure out where you are, what you're talking about, what you're saying. That's not a recipe for an A essay. You don't want to frustrate the reader. Like, I don't understand how this fits. This wasn't in the essay map. This wasn't part of the thesis. Well, this contradicts the thesis. Why is this even here? Good question. One thing to do is after you finish your essay, go back and check and see if everything matches up with your thesis/essay map. And if it doesn't, something needs to give. You need to change, either need to change the thesis/essay map or something in the body of the essay itself. This is the one part of this page that is optional. In lieu of a conclusion, we don't really need a conclusion anyway. It's stylistically, of course, necessary if you're going to publish something or have it published, but we're not. So you may be better served to use that space to think of what someone who may oppose your position might say, and find ways to make concessions if necessary, and demonstrate how and why your thesis still holds anyway. This is normally something that's you just do in this type of essay, but because mine's only 5 pages, I made this optional. So you can either do a conclusion, sort of a classic one that just puts things into, just kind of summarizes your argument, punches it up at the very end as you're sending it off to, for delivery, or use the time and space to come up with, okay, what are the weak points of this argument? Not necessarily yours, but anybody that took this position. Where would be the weak parts of it that somebody might sort of say, wait a minute, come on, I'm not sure that makes sense. And then you head them off at the pass, sometimes by making concessions, saying, okay, well, there's no denying that this is sort of a weaker element. However, if we look at it this way, and bring in this statistic here, we can see that's still true for the most part. So sometimes it's not about making concessions. You can just sort of flat out, no, the other argument is wrong. But here's why. So either way, there still needs to be a marshaling of more, argument, logic, evidence, quotes, whatever it might be, to put down, sort of before it comes up. Anticipate what somebody might say in criticism of your essay. I mean, in the content of it, in the argument you're actually making. So there are your tips for a successful essay all the way around. Have a good day.